Okay, we're starting now. Welcome to day 2 of Afems. Yesterday went fantastically, and I hope that the energy we had yesterday will carry into today and tomorrow. Before I introduce our speaker today, I'd like to make a few announcements. Lost and found, if you have anything that you might have lost yesterday, please come to me or go to Linda. You all know Linda Spencer. If you don't, then just come to me and we'll sort that. And I also want to just make a small announcement about the jewelry that I'm wearing right now. It says Feminist Killjoy and it says Feminist. This is jewelry by Yolandri Apisami. Where's Yolandri? Is she in the room? No? Anyway, should you be interested in purchasing it, you can chat with her. I'll try and find her in the course of the day and introduce her. Shalene just asked me to mention that this is part of the beauty of Afems, that if it's impossible to, or if you are not paying the registration fee, you can do the barter trade, and so this is part of what this is. She has gifted those of us who are organizing Afems. So, yeah. And it's beautiful jewelry, guys. So anyway, we will start. Our speaker today is Kharnita Mohamed, who lectures in social anthropology at the University of Cape Town. She is working on a PhD in women and gender studies at the University of the Western Cape. She has a master's in anthropology from the University of Chicago. Her research is focused on disability, race, and gender towards developing a conceptual framework for a decolonial feminist disability studies. She was raised on the Cape Flats and is frequently confounded by the contradictions of inhabiting post-apartheid South Africa. Her debut novel, Called to Song, which I will recommend, it's a beautiful book, was published by Bella in 2018. Without wasting any more minutes, I will welcome Kharnita to come and speak. Okay. Kharnita, you have 40 to 45 minutes. Unfortunately, that also means no questions. You can approach her after. Yeah? Good. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you everybody for being here, and thank you to Charlene and Linda for inviting me. It's my first keynote, and that it's at Afems is to me one of the most beautiful, nerve-wracking but beautiful moments in my life, and I thank you very, very much. So I cannot give the talk I intended to give. I feel hurt, enraged, unbearably sad. I want to have the good words and a plan, one that ends the litany of death, rape, abduction, violation, violence, fear. I want to lay to rest the names I carry that get heavier and heavier, and not to have to add more names. I don't have a plan or the good words. And if those words come, they come after the fact. Usually after I've shut myself away, turning over and over events and outcomes and connections and permutations, and trying to make sense of a world that really makes sense. Usually after the damage is done. And then I get to wrap the feeling in abstraction with the examples I carry to think the world, and transmute it into something that makes my feminist rage, my feminist hope seem cool and measured. I feel off-kilter, though, as so many of us do, disconnected. There is something about this moment, about the intensity and intensification of violence we cannot hide from, we cannot rest from, retreat from. Not that we ever could, not if we were alert to the world. There is something about this moment, though, the violence against women, children, other Africans, the endemic violence on the Cape Flats, the violence against the environment, the violence against psyches, against how we conceive of the world, the violence of work if you are lucky enough to have it, the violence of the far right and the space they are claiming in a world where these spectacles, policies, discourses, actions of cruelty and spite, the unremitting wars in the Middle East, the violence of Islamophobia, the violence of hunger, poverty, desperation, the violence against our bodies. Both universities I am located in, UCT and UWC, are in mourning, as are many other campuses across the country. 2 campuses, 2 young women, and a grandfather who has been just erased out of the narrative, murdered by men. It feels as if all day long, every day, for weeks, more names were added to that long, long list we all carry. On this campus, other campuses, in neighborhoods where few would see a campus, in places where all the world was on offer. And this week, we have been screaming our right to existence, our right to freedom, to safety, to a world in which we are all, each one of us, held and cared for. And yet, the world continues in the face of our grief, a grief that is beginning to feel like a constant. It feels like a violence that the world gets to continue. Violence, one of its definitions, is the interruption of the everyday. Except this is no interruption. This ubiquity of violence and omnipresence and the omnipresence of its disavowal. And one does the work of screaming, but hey, this is the everyday, this constancy is the ordinary for some of us. And you learn, no matter how good the words, if the audience is unwilling or unethical or too fatigued or invested in maintaining worlds that maim, worlds that debilitate, they will render those worlds ordinary and beneath notice. That is, if they hear you at all. If you are enough of a person, have accrued to yourself enough social capital or epistemic authority. And that silence, that refusal, disavowal, as we well know, is a violence too. It does not only maintain, sustain, reproduce, it participates. Silence is act, silence is choice. And we continue. In the face of the violence just around the corner where black people are harming and terrorizing other black people, far too learned in Afrophobia, in fear and desperation with nowhere to go, the violence somewhere on this campus, the echoes of violence in this room, so many of us encounter in those smooth deliveries of ideas where we don't exist, or if we do, we exist as fantasies of small-feeted and paranoid imaginations that knows us only through the lens of domination. As objects to control, rescue, or raise up in a horror show of granting us the humanity we already had and whose version of what it means to be human we really don't want. So as you may have surmised, I'm going to talk about violence for a bit. Violence animates my work. No matter how I try to escape it, to couch it in clever words or abstractions, I find myself returning again and again to try and understand what makes it possible to damage another, and how we live in its aftermath, in its presence, and how violence lives in us too. In how we love, hate, portion out our days, when we're walking in the world, how we carry the fear of violence or its propensity. How our histories make particular kinds of violence possible, and how we think engenders or delimits violence. I think about how so much violence is wrapped in love. We teach each other to shape ourselves, our bodies, our hair, our accents, in ways that do not turn us into objects of ridicule, objects to be humiliated. I think about that often. How so much of the training into fear and shame of appearing too black, too white, too coloured, too Cape Malay, too feminine, too masculine, too queer, too straight, too Muslim, too secular, too educated, too unlearned, and on is not meant to injure, but to teach the survival skills needed in a racist, heteropatriarchal, ableist capitalist world. How intertwined the work of love is with regulation. And I think about this primarily through disability, how discourses of disability are used. You know, don't act blind, why are you walking this way, are you crippled, why are you... How a lot of that is an attempt to regulate and govern that we appear as if we are normal, so the production of normalcy. I wonder what we do when we call it collusion, to the hard work of learning how to survive in worlds where what you feel on the inside is not how you will be treated by someone who has the power, the will to beat into you, who you should be with their fists, with the law, with a racist insult, to do to you what the admonition to behave, to be respectable, to not stand out, lest you be noticed, attempted to protect you from, because very frequently this training into respectability is about attempting to diminish the possibility of a particular kind of violence resting on you. So it's violence to undo violence. And I think there's a from our historical perspective, to think that those are acts of unconsciousness rather than acts of survival is a violence of historical proportion that doesn't allow us to connect intergenerationally in ways that provide the kind of care we wish for our generation. Liberal notions of agency don't really help us, as Saba Mahmood has shown. Liberal notions of agency can't fully understand how we are interpolated or misrecognized by our mothers, patriarchy, the state, mining companies, fossil fuel companies, and agribusiness with their thirst to poison our land and air. We are misrecognized, we are interpolated, and we can be acted upon irrespective of how we feel on the inside. All the violences are connected. The violence on streets where men shoot and beat and stab other men, where men order other men to bear arms to subjugate the populations, where men beat women and children, where women beat children. And it's interesting to me how we take up the narrative of what men are doing, but I don't know if you recall that nursery school teacher was beating their child. And it was horrifying to watch, and we have to think about that too, those kinds of violences. Where someone in an office signs away the right to a decent livelihood, a decent home, a possibility for a thriving life for another person. Where a person cannot go to a beach without being maligned, where a person can work hard day after day and go to bed with the pangs of hunger. Where a sick person can be made to sit outside for hours waiting for the care that sometimes doesn't come. All the violences are connected. It is our task to find those connections. Very frequently, we take the symptom for the condition itself. Violence is a symptom of untenable, uninhabitable modes of sociality, and we need to fundamentally restructure the world we live in so that the very possibility of doing damage to another person is unthinkable, undoable, and the person who would do this damage is anything but normal. Where winning a life and living your best life, for showing you are better than somebody else, is not even something we can conceive. And we live in this age, this mediated age, right? Making envy a social boon, the thing upon which status rests. So the desire for hierarchy is the desire to enact violence on the psyche of another. Many of the tools we have inherited, the tools that are celebrated, to think those connections are so fundamentally geared towards producing a world in which hierarchies of subjectivity are normalized. These are the inheritances of patriarchy, misogyny, racism, and capitalism, colonialism, ableism, homophobia, and on and on. I'm not aiming for a straight line, for an argument to persuade you of anything in particular. If you're in this room doing feminist work, you will need no persuasion. Many of us come into this room, these spaces, because of how male violence, reshaped who we were, who we could have been in a different world. How we try to understand violence, the shapes it takes might differ, and how we would resolve it and where we would look for it might take different forms, but of its existence as a constitutive force, we would all be in agreement. So what I'm going to render instead is largely a catalogue of feeling and some of the epistemic questions I have, because it is the grounds of my work, the grounds of my epicentres of agency, as Mularo Undiri tells us we should work from. I'm going to start with longing. It was a longing I didn't know I had and didn't know that I should want until I read Toni Morrison's essay Race Matters in the early 2000s. I want, and I quote, I want to imagine not the threat of freedom or its tentative gasping fragility, but the concrete thrill of borderlessness, a kind of out-of-doors safety, where a sleeping woman could always rise from a bed, wrap a shawl around her shoulders, and sit on the steps in the moonlight. And if she felt like it, she could walk out the yard and on down the road, no lamp and no fear. A hiss, crackle from the side of the road would never scare her, because whatever it was that made the sound, it wasn't something creeping up on her. Nothing for 90 miles around thought she was prey. She could stroll as slowly as she liked, think of food preparations, war or family things, or lift her eyes to stars and think of nothing at all. Lampless and without fear, she could make her way. The idea of a world of absolute safety is the one I hold to. To think the worlds we have inherited. What that must feel like under the moon, to sit so freely on the steps, or the stoop, actually. This fragment haunts me. It is, and a few of the paragraphs that follow, and it's beautiful because the woman walks out, and she passes a house, and she hears the sound of a crying baby, and she knocks on the door, and she goes inside, and she helps the other woman soothe the baby, and then she might just leave again. And I mean, just the idea of that is, can't even imagine it. But it's all I actually remember of the essay. I don't know what the rest of the essay is about. I go and I just read that bit. So, the desire for this world to live without a sense of huntedness, to live in a borderless world, where everyone can enjoy the moonlight, forces me to ask what the meaning of politics really is. What is its ends and what is it for? Something I like to say is, you have to dream a world where your liberation does not require your boot on anyone's neck. And if your version of liberation requires the subjugation of others, we don't want it. And that's a very sort of, I've written it in a very sort of anthropocentric way, but this also includes the environment and other species. The only way we get to a world in which the moonlight is ours to enjoy as we please without the weight of huntedness is if no one's humanity depends on the subjugation of others. There's something in this vision of freedom that makes the violence of the everyday with which we live palpable. But it is a necessary vision. Feminist hope is necessary to remember the kind of world we work for, to taste its contours, to feel the moon on our face as we stroll without fear. As Sarah Ahmad states, politics without hope is impossible, and hope without politics is a reification of possibility. Hope is crucial to the act of protest. Hope is what allows us to feel that what angers us is not inevitable, even if transformation can sometimes feel impossible. Indeed, anger without hope can lead to despair or a sense of tiredness, produced by the inevitability of the repetition of that which one is against. And so feminist hope requires and demands a commitment. Because we are more than the sum of our fears. We love, we laugh, we joy, we trust that there is thriving to be had in the midst of a world so far removed from a moonlight stroll usually strikes me as a miracle. And this too we should never forget, that we are more than the world we have inherited offers us, larger than it expects. We may be told over and over that we are not where love resides. We will be loved anyway. We may be told over and over that we do not hold the shape and color that love comes from. We love anyway. And I try to remember that in as much as we are pain, anger, hate, fear, disgust, contempt, anxiety, depression, numbness, horror, sorrow, we are also love, joy, laughter, hope, faith, trust, kindness, satisfaction. If we can, we need to feel it all. In a world that demands we are numb to violence, we are numb to pain, we are numb. If we can feel it all. The hard stuff matters. It is where empathy lies, compassion, recognition. It took me a very long time to learn that. Numbness does not save you. But also, numbness to the pain of others, to your own pain, is how we get to this world so steeped in violence. Masculinity, after all, the kind that is vicious and cruel, that has no substrate of tenderness, and is killed of empathy, is because of the limited registers of feeling men are allowed. Something I learned about violence in my research was that one of the ways in which race, gender difference, and inequality gets made is through assuming inesthetic worlds for others, You can do whatever you want to people who you imagine are incapable of feeling. You can build them shacks smaller than your bathroom and call it a social housing project because you do not imagine that they are able to care, to feel and need what you need. White, wealthy worlds, where every discomfort, every possible thing that might cause pain, the little leaf that might flutter in the immaculate road, the little whiff of decay, is removed before it can cause discomfort. A lot of men's anger, a lot of white rage is about inconvenience, discomfort, entitlement, an expectation that what they feel and desire is more important than what anyone else is feeling. And this, of course, is intersectional relative to where you're located in these hierarchies of subjectivity. In a world that prefers we are numb and desensitized, if you can feel it all. And if you cannot, if the world has asked too much of you, as it so often does, then that too is okay. Rest. Our capacity to carry the density of affect waxes and wanes, our bodies and psychoaffective lives differ. That they differ does not matter. What needs to change is that some differences are valued over others. That some ways of being in the world are narrow and impossible ways of being in the world. That is the problem. Above all, we need a world in which we do not enforce narrow ideas of the best way to be. Elaine Squari speaks to the incommunicability of pain, that there is something in pain that resists language, resists description, even as it is all-encompassing. And it is somewhat true. There is something in the particularity of pain that is so uniquely yours, even as parts of it has been shared by others. The specificity of your experiences, however, shape the feeling of pain. But as Sarah Ahmad tells us, just because pain is thought to be a solitary thing and uniquely ours does not mean that it cannot be shared. This is why we witness. And I worry about this sometimes because a lot of the mindfulness discourse is about, and you have to remember the mindfulness discourse comes out of a corporate logic that wanted to make it okay to lay with lots of people. But it's traveled out into society, and so how people respond now is to say, no, I don't want anything to touch me that's going to make the slightest discomfort come my way. But witness matters. Okay, where was that? Okay. The importance of bearing witness to the pain of others is how we find our way through and to each other. It is how we take the personal and make it political. How we find our politics and live our politics. By sitting with the unbearability of each other's pain and holding space so that we may give each other the recognition that events of damage, events of cruelty refuse us. It is how we make community. Even as we know that political economies that regulate and normalize maiming does not give us events of damage, but a structure where maiming and damage is ordinary. So we can ignore the massification of trauma, violent injury, and death that women experience, that people who live in violent neighborhoods experience. We tend to count death, to act on death, to theorize death, to be shocked by the death of young women, young men, children. For many people, violence will not result in death. Violence, and this is the thanatopolitical, so a lot of the theories that we use to think about the organization of death and the capacity to maim, it comes to us through the thanatopolitical, which is mobilized by people like Foucault, Agamben, Robert Esposito, etc., and then taken up in feminist discourse through governmentality, biopolitics, etc. Violence will have ongoing effects in domestic violence, have ongoing effects after sexual violence. Continuous experiences of violence, such as those experienced by people living in neighborhoods with high rates of violence, prolonged sexual abuse or domestic violence can result in, and I quote Couture, and just listen to what complex trauma does. No? Difficulty regulating affective impulses such as anger and self-destructiveness, dissociative episodes, a chronic sense of guilt or responsibility, difficulty trusting people or feeling intimate, hopelessness or despair, and other somatic or medical problems. The effects on sociality with shared and collective complex trauma is an everyday reality is frequently misrecognized under the sign of violence. If we call it violent neighborhoods, violent people, not only do we get to make race, ensure the endurance of inequality, but best of all, we can ignore them. You cannot change what you have essentialized. So violence is both a cause and a symptom. Violence is frequently ongoing and has effects. Bodies are fragile, psyches are fragile. Disability, debility, or materializations of structural violence, a lot of which goes unnamed if you are poor, black, female, queer. And so we have to attend to structure even as we react to event. Patriarchy does not offer us an event, homophobia does not offer us an event, racist capital does not offer us an event, even as it attempts to turn structure into event through individualizing. Focus on the bad apple, the monster. Say it is once off, it is not all men, not all whites, not all billionaires, not all, not all, not all, even as we are the all enfolded within everyday violence. Take medication for your anxiety. You have a disorder, not our society is disordered and we live in a female fear factory. It is easier to pathologize individuals than destroy the massification of vulnerability, the distribution of vulnerability, that as feminists we know is intersectional and distributed unevenly. And until the most vulnerable is free, none of us is free. It is easier to turn structure into event and focus on people with disabilities after violent acts have changed their bodies and psyches, and so ignore the worlds in which violence has been given free rein, ignore the unequal distribution of resources, and that citizen does not mean the same thing for every person. It is easier to turn structure into event because to undo the rapist's power, the batterer's power, the murderer's power, is to weaken the patriarchal dividend and spoil the pleasures of homosociality. It is easier to turn structure into event, and so we continue to have people displaced in the countries and continent of their birth, evicted on lands where generations' bodies were broken to make wine for the tables of the wealthy. It is easier to turn structure into event, and so we can point militarized police and mercenaries who are trained in the arenas of war at students who are students and not soldiers, students and not enemy combatants. We can point soldiers and mercenaries at people who are citizens and not soldiers, citizens and not enemy combatants. It is easier to turn structure into event, and so ignore that we have a long history of Afrophobia, a long history of anti-black racism, and every now and then, just to show that we are ethical, that something like the law exists, as fictive as it is for many of us, we convict one or two, fine one or two, and let how many go. It is easier to turn structure into event than to recognize that the majority of our popular culture rests on grooming men and women to treat domination as seduction, violence as manly, excess and consumption as worth, environmental destruction as progress. This is a long fight. And while I was writing this, I noticed this, which I hadn't noticed before, so great. Have you noticed that to undo violence, the metaphors we use are martial metaphors, wars and fights and battles? This is very Anglocentric discourse, and what would it be to shift that? So, I don't know. The work of undoing predatory and violent masculinities is a marathon. It is not a sprint. The affect of this moment will wane. We are mourning. This is not the first time we have had national outrage. This is not the last time we will feel broken by the intensity of the moment, nor the last we will be made to remember how close and palpable the massification of violence is in our society, and not the last time we will lose people who are dear to us, young women whose very existence in the world gave us hope, women we may never have encountered elsewhere. There have been many such moments, far too many, where the wellspring of feeling brought people together to ask, what are we as a country, what are we to each other, how did we get here? Life is a Domeni, Marikana, Anin Boyson, Uyaneni, Jesse. This level of intensity will be hard to sustain. The rhythms and routines of our lives will slowly reassert themselves. Some will find a new normal, and as feminists, we really do. And I won't speak for others here. For me, the rage is something soft and relentless, slow and steady. It is a marathon, it is not a sprint. And in some ways, for me, that is where feminist hope resides. This rage is a quiet thing that seeks to break this world and make one in which we all get to walk under the moon, lampless and without fear. Epistemology, right? We need the kinds of tools that allow us to think about the interconnectedness of violence. To quote Audre Lorde, there is no thing as a single-issue struggle because we do not live single-issue lives. And to invoke Adrienne Rich, we need to write and read as if our lives depend on it, because it does. We do not have much time. Not if we take seriously that ecological destruction will result in incalculable effects. Yvette Abrams, and some of you will remember, at the first Afems made a comment that has haunted me for the last 2 years. She asked, what are we doing to prepare our students for a world that will be radically different in 50 years because ecological destruction will fundamentally reshape the earth? There won't be computers, the infrastructure we think will be there won't be there. And we do not have much time. The toolkits we have inherited carries the weight of histories that are not ours, although they really, really are. So when we're talking about these Western canons, these canons that come from elsewhere, these canons have so fundamentally shaped our ontological imaginaries that they actually are. They really, really, really are. We're so entangled that to do the work of disentangling frequently requires you to take the remainders of what was 10 minutes? Oh, okay, no, not okay. So we cannot separate ourselves from the colonial encounter, even as we must heal from it. Our toolkits point us at questions that are not our concern and often are distractions, and offer us processes that close openings and hamper understanding. I'm a very slow thinker. It worries me, and it worries me that it worries me. On the one hand, there's the urgency of our time and the very real threat of species destruction, and on the other, the neoliberal institutions within which we work, expecting our level of productivity to exceed human capacities. Both will kill you, right? The temporality of knowledge production and the institutions within which we are expected to work and engage in complex thinking enables the perdurance of violence, particularly given the epistemic fallacies we have inherited. And I'm going to shift voice here because it's quicker. So these are some of the questions I'm hoping to explore over the next few years after the PhD is in at the end of the year. So one of the points I will argue is that we are in a paradigmatic sense, and this is all of us, irrespective of whether you're writing from a Eurocentric position, whether you're writing as a feminist or anti-racist scholar, etc. Is we deploy an extractive logic and produce Frankensteinian subjects to animate our texts. All the texts we use are historically located, and the subjects within those texts are grounded in situated ontological imaginaries. Frequently, when we are producing analysis, we will cobble together an idea of the subject by collapsing multiple ontological imaginaries, erasing the historicity of some of the texts, particularly when some ideas are theory and some are data. So you'll grab an idea from Foucault, you'll grab an idea from whoever it is you grab your ideas from. You'll grab a little bit here, you'll grab a little bit there. Those subjects have multiple ontological imaginaries that have been collapsed into them, and then you continue this sort of collapse, right? And so what animates our text very rarely has correspondence to how people are experiencing the world and the conditions that are related to this world, because we're doing this and it's a problem. The insights we allow to transcend history, and those usually are the things we think of as theory, and those subjects in those texts get to transcend history. Frequently have epistemic effects. Very frequently we are misled, sometimes by the texts we love the most. And for our purposes here, to bring one into solidarity with a thinker across time and space is not the same as bringing one into epistemic or ontological equivalence. So the ways in which we collapse that is. The second point would be about epistemic uncertainty and liberatory praxis. And so because we cannot really be sure of our toolkit, we should be suspicious, but not and we have to accept it as a condition that's not paralyzing, because you have to proceed anyway. The archive we inherited requires mediation so that we don't make fictive ontological equivalences that erase history. As feminists, we would agree that situated knowledge and reflexivity matters. We would also agree that there are multiple ways of knowing, not just in regards to race, gender, sexuality, etc., but also what kind of body someone has, whether they are visually impaired or neurodiverse, etc. We would also agree that the archive, however constituted, is limited. What this entails is the existence of multiple or plural epistemologies, or what Mignola calls pluriversalities. It also means a degree of skepticism that we should hold in regard to the archive, and again, I doubt we would be in disagreement about that. But perhaps where our skepticism lands might be contested. Given this multiplicity and skepticism, we require transversal politics when we navigate the archive, so a dialogical mode of engaging with the archive. So transversal politics not just, and this is Yuval Davis, of course, transversal politics not just in how we build community, but also in how we respond to the archive. So root from where you are and shift into those other communities and epistemic communities to find what is useful. We also need pedagogies that provide openings for the emergence of epistemologies we cannot imagine, because if you have multiple epistemologies and we accept this as a given, we can't all be sitting in such individualized senses because it makes the politics impossible. But we also have to recognize that the epistemologies our students that are going to produce are things we cannot begin to imagine, not if we're doing our job properly, because your job is to make yourself obsolete and let them answer their own questions for their moment. So we have to teach multiple histories, because if we don't, we risk the threat of repetition, and you see this when people aren't reading, right? And then they give you this thing, and it's like wonderful, and you go like, oh, so you're really a structuralist, huh? You're really a functionalist, you know? And this really happens because the engagement in the archive, this epistemology of refusal, is very frequently not an epistemology born with an engagement of the archive. It is just a refusal, and so it produces an ahistoricity that is very dangerous, I think. Okay. And we want toolkits that allow the archive to be evaluated so as to train knowledge producers and not consumers. Epistemic uncertainty requires resisting canon formation, even if they're our favorites, because canon formation always produces reification, a kind of static, a kind of status, etc. Produces a reification of history and frequently spatial-temporal collapse. Third, a big question for me in the last year or so is, given that we live with the threat of environmental destruction, means that the materiality of the archive matters. What we think worth saving matters, and that we plan for it now. So if we accept that the sea levels, and I know it sounds paranoid a little, and it's okay. If the sea levels are going to rise, if we're going to have earthquakes and massive shifts in the terrain upon which we were, it means you can't depend on the servers. And someone has said that most of that infrastructure will not be terrestrial in a few decades, because a lot of it is going to be satellites. But that still imagines that we'd have electricity, etc., etc. Not everybody will have access to that kind of technology. But if we accept that there will be fundamental shifts in some of the cities that we live in, those of us who live in coastal cities, those of us who live on spaces that are prone to hurricanes, etc., etc. It means that there will be infrastructural damage, and we should be prepared to build an archive, to seed an archive somewhere, and think about what the materiality of that is, and it would probably take multiple forms. And for many of us, we know that if you're interested in reading black writing, you have to hunt as if people haven't written. And when you begin to hunt, you realize that there is so much more than you can read in a lifetime. Because the work exists, it just does not exist in relation to each other. It is not easy to find, work is out of print. And so to actually, and that's not something I'm going to do. Someone must do it. Please, like build it, find the funding, build the thing somewhere, and, get people to donate. To donate their work, to donate their library, build the kind of archive we want. But if we take epistemic uncertainty seriously, and we believe that ahistorical analysis matter, we cannot refuse to include those texts of the people we think we hate, because we have to give someone, somewhere, at some point in the future, we're never going to inhabit, the opportunity to go and see how the world we live in, what continuities that the world that they live in has to those modes of thinking. And so we cannot limit the archive. And so it entails thinking about the scope of the archive. Okay, so epistemic uncertainty demands that the archive be as extensive as possible to prepare for this kind of future. Fourth, and still very early for me is, and this is, this notion of working from the epicentres of your agency. So I go through periods where I can't read, I can't think. All I want to do is watch another series. I see some of you are nodding. I read something, I throw the book across the room, and I say, F you, and I think I'll never read again, ever. And this is, and when one is situated, and it's taken me like a while, and it's really been like in confrontation with people whose ontological imaginaries are so different, that you recognize that you are in a moment of epistemic shift. That you are, because epistemes are carried by us, we are the bearers of episteme. Who we read, who we won't read. This is how epistemology gets made in conversation, in dialogue, in the books we share with each other. But episteme has an affect, and that affective burden of episteme produces stuff. Produces paralysis, it produces, I don't want to be in the university. I think they're beautiful, but it has effects, and we want to think about the affective burden of what epistemic violence feels like, what it does, what it produces. So, what epistemic violence feels like is frequently presents itself as being blocked, unwillingness to read, bewilderment, alienation, anger, sadness, and on. But also an overwhelming sense of accountability, because the recognition that knowledge can cause spirit death, epistemicide, may induce fear and caution. You have to do the work anyway. Took me a long time to get there, but okay. The fear of failing can be paralyzing. You have to fail anyway. And you have to feel entitled to fail. And I tell my students, usually when you're reading these texts, you're reading someone at the end of a process. You cannot be expected to have your process look like the ends of someone's process. Some of this stuff is like 10 years of thinking and not writing. So by the time the work emerges in the public, it has taken on so many transformations, and you cannot compare the beginnings or the middle of your stage to the end of somebody else. This is why we feel like imposters. And you must be allowed to fail. Yeah. And this is why it matters to not just call people out, but to also call them in. To recognize that we are historically located, and we are all capable of changing. And if you don't believe that people are capable of changing, then what are we doing anyway? Right? The epistemic effect of affect is also related to genres of communication, and how pleasure as an epistemic sensibility in navigating scholarly writing and reading has archival effects. So many students will say they don't want to read these texts, they're too dense, they're not fun to read, because the modality of reading, that sensibility in reading, wants an easily graspable pleasure sometimes. But dabbling with a difficult text gives you a different kind of pleasure somewhere much later in your relationship with it. When you finally get a text, whether you hate it or love it, doesn't matter. But when you sort of get a relationship to that text at some point, there's a different kind of pleasure, but it's a pleasure that takes a little longer to unfold. And one of the things I worry about is the shift into modes of language that are more palatable, is that we're going to close up the archive. Because I know when I went to Chicago, I come from UWC, and we usually read critiques of texts. We didn't read the original texts themselves. So I get to Chicago, and I have to finally meet these texts originally. They aren't what the critiques claim they are. They're very different. Some of the critiques make sense, but there are other aspects and elements. And this is what Ogundipe says too, right? You have to claim this archive, this Euro-American archive, and choose the work you take towards a project of liberation. I mean, the principle of liberation, the principle of justice should negotiate the reading. But you get there and you realize that actually the questions that are generated by an actual engagement with those texts are so profoundly different to the questions you've inherited. And you cannot see what these epistemic arrangements are. You cannot see the differences in history. You cannot see the ways in which, like, you know, we receive Descartes, for example, and we use him in these reductive ways. We talk about him in these reductive ways. But actually, he was so debated in his moment. And those debates have gotten erased. So when we imagine a particular historicity, we are also doing a reduction that doesn't help us in the present. And when we close up the archive, when we say these are too difficult, we don't like the way this reads, etc., we are all, because I had to go and learn the skills of reading this text, and it took me years. You know, whereas if we're already training people into engaging with those texts, I mean, transmitting how to read this in an ethical way, in a way that leads towards epistemic justice, then people don't have to do this work. And scholars, I mean, I think we might be at risk of losing a generation of scholars for whom parts of the archive are closed. We'll never meet those texts, never ever develop the kinds of critiques of the present that we require or the future, but we'll have almost done one paragraph. So epistemic effect is also related to genres of communication and how pleasure as an epistemic sensibility in navigating scholarly writing and reading has archival effects. Something I worry about is that if you forego the reading of texts that challenge contemporary Englishes or other languages, that we might end up closing the archive for some future scholars or make the work of learning the skills of reading across time and space challenging. There are different kinds of pleasures in reading text that resist interpretation based on the level of attentiveness with which one engages. So, these questions around epistemology matters, to me at any rate, because in my work on disability, it is very clear that the terms, the theories to which we understand inequality and its production do not help us and frequently obfuscates. The scale of violence in the global south is staggering. For a just world, where men cannot imagine maiming or harming another person, for cruelty to end, for a political economy where our freedom depends on the freedom of everyone around us, requires an archive that is not mediated by Frankensteinian logic. This alienated, disconnected mode of knowing and passing the world facilitates erasures that are fatal and painful in far too many ways to count. For us all to be able to walk under the moon, lampless and without fear, requires that our rage and pain guide us to a livable world we can all inhabit where for 90 miles around, no one thinks of you as prey. Thank you.